Imagine stepping into a world where the air hums with the weight of unspoken rules, where every choice you might dream of making, whom to love, where to live, what to wear, is snatched away before you can even grasp it. Picture a life where your body, your voice, and your very existence are not your own, but belong to others: a father, a husband, a priest, a king. This was the reality for women in the Middle Ages, a time often romanticized in paintings of ladies in flowing gowns, their faces serene, their lives seemingly enchanted. But as an independent historian, I've spent years digging into the shadows of history, the places where polished narratives of textbooks and ballads dare not linger. What I found is a story of women who were not just overlooked, but systematically silenced, their lives shaped by forces that saw them as little more than property. Let's walk through their world together, not as distant observers, but as witnesses to their resilience, their pain, and the quiet ways they fought back. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were a time when society was built on rigid hierarchies. Kings and nobles sat at the top, followed by knights, clergy, and peasants, each locked into their place. But for women, regardless of class, the rules were even stricter. From the moment a girl was born, her life was mapped out, not by her dreams or ambitions, but by the needs of her family and the demands of a patriarchal system. She was not a person in the eyes of the law, the church, or even her own kin. She was a tool, a bargaining chip, a vessel for alliances or heirs. A girl of 6 or 7 could find herself betrothed, her hand promised to a man she'd never met, often decades older, sometimes a widower with children of his own. By 12, she could be legally married, her childhood bartered away in a contract she had no voice in. These marriages weren't about love or partnership. They were transactions. A dowry, perhaps livestock, a plot of land, or a chest of handmade linens, sealed the deal, and the bride was handed over like a deed to property. This wasn't just a custom. It was a legal and cultural cage. The church, the backbone of medieval morality, preached that a woman's role was obedience, first to her father, then to her husband. Canon law, which governed much of daily life, reinforced this. A woman's consent in marriage was rarely sought, and if she dared to refuse, the consequences were dire. She might be beaten until she complied, disowned by her family, or sent to a convent, a fate that, while offering some reprieve from marriage, came with its own form of confinement. I've read accounts in medieval court records, dusty parchments tucked away in archives, where girls as young as 10 were described as willful for hesitating to marry men 3 times their age. Their punishment? Public shaming, physical discipline, or, in extreme cases, exile from their communities. One such record from 14th century England describes a girl named Agnes, who, at 13, fled her village rather than marry a widowed merchant. She was caught, beaten, and returned to her father, who promptly handed her over to her betrothed. Her story ends there, lost to history, but it's a stark reminder of how little agency women had. Once married, a woman's life became an extension of her husband's will. He decided where she went, whom she spoke to, what she wore, even what she ate. Her body was his to command, and the concept of marital rape simply didn't exist. Medieval law, rooted in Roman and Germanic traditions, granted a husband natural rights over his wife's body. If she resisted, she was sinning against God and man. The church, ever present, reinforced this with sermons that cast disobedience as a moral failing. I've come across theological texts from the period, like those by Thomas Aquinas, that argue a wife's submission was divinely ordained, her suffering attests to virtue. This wasn't just ideology, it was a lived reality. A woman's labor, whether spinning wool, tending fields, or raising children, belonged to her husband. If she earned a penny selling eggs at the market, it was his to claim. She couldn't own property, sign a contract, or write a will without his permission. Her existence was tethered to his authority, and any attempt to step outside that role risked punishment. Childbirth was another inescapable burden. Women were expected to bear children as often as their bodies could endure, sometimes every year or two. Contraception was condemned as heresy, and abortion was equated with murder. I've studied medical manuals from the time, written by monks who had never seen a woman's body up close, yet prescribed remedies for fertility or childbirth with chilling confidence. One text from 12th century France suggests drinking a concoction of herbs and animal fat to strengthen the womb, a recipe more likely to poison than to help. The expectation to produce heirs, especially sons, was relentless. A woman who failed to conceive or who bore only daughters could be cast aside, her failure a stain on her worth. And each pregnancy was a gamble with death. Without knowledge of germs or antiseptics, childbirth was a leading cause of mortality. I found estimates in historical demography studies suggesting that 1 in 4 women died from complications like blood loss or infection. The tools used by midwives, crude, unsterilized, often did more harm than good. Yet, the Church taught that such suffering was God's will, a punishment for Eve's sin. Even in death, a woman's autonomy was denied. Suicide, a desperate escape for some, was a grave sin, punishable by posthumous shame. Her body might be denied burial in consecrated ground, her family ostracized. Widowhood, far from offering freedom, often brought new forms of control. A widow without a male heir could lose her home, her belongings, even her children, to a male guardian appointed by her late husband's family. Remarriage wasn't her choice either. It was often arranged to secure alliances or protect property. I've read wills from noble women in 15th century Italy, carefully dictated by male scribes, that left their estates not to their daughters but to distant male relatives, ensuring the family's wealth stayed in capable hands. The law saw women as partial persons, their signatures meaningless without a man's endorsement. Even noble women, draped in silk and educated in poetry, lived in what one chronicler called a gilded cage, their lives dictated by fathers, husbands, or royal advisors. The Church's influence extended beyond marriage and law into the very fabric of daily life. Women were taught to see their suffering as redemptive, their obedience as holy. Sermons preached that a woman's worth lay in her submission, her silence, her fertility. Yet, this same Church that exalted virginity and motherhood offered no protection when a husband's moderate beatings left bruises or broken bones. Legal codes, like the 13th century Statutes of Westminster, permitted husbands to chastise their wives, as long as the punishment didn't result in death. Court records from medieval France and England reveal cases where women sought justice for abuse, only to be dismissed or blamed. One woman, Marjorie of York, petitioned a court in 1375 after her husband broke her arm. The judge ruled that she had provoked him by speaking out of turn. Her story, like so many others, was buried in the margins of history, uncovered only by those willing to sift through the dust of forgotten archives. But the weight of control didn't stop at the law or the Church. It seeped into the rhythm of a woman's everyday life, where even the smallest tasks carried the burden of expectation. A peasant woman woke before dawn, her day a relentless cycle of labor. She churned butter, spun wool, mended clothes, and tended to children, all while her husband worked the fields or answered to a lord. If the harvest was poor, she might skip meals to ensure her children ate. Her hands, calloused and cracked, told a story of survival, not choice. In towns, women worked as brewers, weavers, or market vendors, their earnings funneled directly to their husbands. I found tax rolls from 14th century London listing women as alewives, their small profits meticulously recorded, yet legally owned by their spouses. Even their labor wasn't theirs. For noble women, life was less physically grueling, but no less constrained. They were trained in embroidery, music, and manners, their education a polished facade for their true purpose, to be traded in marriage for political gain. A noblewoman's dowry might include gold or estates, but her role was the same as a peasant's, to serve her husband's lineage. I've read letters from noble women like Eleanor of Provence, queen consort in 13th century England, whose correspondence reveals a keen mind trapped by protocol. She negotiated with barons and managed estates, yet her decisions required her husband's seal. Even queens were pawns in a larger game, their pregnancies scrutinized, their sons celebrated, their daughters often ignored. Childbirth was a crucible for women of all classes. In peasant huts, a midwife might be the only attendant, her knowledge passed down through generations, often mixed with superstition. In noble households, childbirth was a public spectacle, with dozens of witnesses ensuring the legitimacy of the heir. I've studied chronicles of royal births, like that of Isabella of France in 1295, where courtiers crowded the birthing chamber, their presence more about politics than care. The tools of delivery were crude, metal hooks, unwashed hands, and the risk of infection was ever present. Childbed fever, a silent killer, claimed countless lives, its cause unknown to a world that blamed bad air or divine wrath. After birth, women used whatever was at hand to stop bleeding, ashes, soot, even bread, methods that often led to infection. The cycle of pregnancy, birth, and recovery was unrelenting, each delivery a roll of the dice. The Church's grip on reproduction was ironclad. Contraception, when attempted, was a dangerous secret. Women shared recipes for herbal concoctions, nettles, rue, pennyroyal, whispered in the shadows of markets or convents. These remedies were as likely to cause illness as prevent pregnancy, but their use speaks to a desperate need for control. Abortion was even riskier, equated with murder by the Church and punishable by excommunication or death. I've found records of women tried in ecclesiastical courts for procuring miscarriage, their fates sealed by confessions extracted under duress. The Church's obsession with purity extended to menstruation, which was seen as a moral failing. Women were expected to hide it, even from their families, using makeshift pads that chafed and leaked. In rural areas, where water was scarce, washing these rags was a grueling task, often done in secret to avoid shame. Punishment for stepping out of line was swift and brutal. A woman who spoke too loudly, refused her husband's commands, or simply looked at the wrong person could face public humiliation. In England, the scold's bridle was a metal cage fitted over the head, a plate pressing down on the tongue to silence unruly speech. I've seen drawings of these devices in medieval legal texts, their spikes and chains a chilling reminder of the cost of defiance. In some towns, women were strapped to chairs and dunked in ponds, a punishment that could turn deadly. Adultery, or even suspicion of it, carried lethal consequences. A woman might be thrown into a river to prove her innocence. If she drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty and faced execution. These trials, documented in court rolls, were less about justice than control, a public warning to other women. Yet control was never absolute. Women found ways to resist, often in the cracks of the system. Midwives, for instance, were more than birth attendants. They were keepers of women's secrets, sharing knowledge of herbs and rituals that could delay or prevent pregnancy. In convents, where women were sent to escape marriage or punishment, some found a semblance of autonomy, learning to read or write in defiance of societal norms. I've read accounts of nuns like Hildegard of Bingen, whose mystical writings challenged the Church's monopoly on knowledge, though even she had to cloak her ideas and divine visions to be heard. In villages, women formed informal networks, sharing food, childcare, or warnings about abusive husbands. These small acts of solidarity were lifelines, rarely recorded but vital to survival. The courtroom of the Middle Ages was a place where justice was a double-edged sword, especially for women. The legal system, whether secular or ecclesiastical, was built on the assumption of male superiority. A woman's testimony carried little weight. Her signature was invalid without a man's endorsement. If she sought justice, say, for a beating or theft, she had to navigate a labyrinth of male gatekeepers, judges, clerks, and lords, all predisposed to dismiss her. I've studied court rolls from 13th century Germany, where women accused of disorderly conduct were punished for offenses as vague as gossiping or wandering. One case describes a woman named Gretel, fined for selling bread at the market without her husband's permission. Her defense, that she needed the money to feed her children, was ignored. Punishments were designed to shame as much as to hurt. The pillory, a wooden frame in the town square, was a common fate for women deemed too outspoken. Chained for hours or days, they endured jeers, rotten food, and worse. In some regions, women were forced to wear shame costumes, bright capes or collars inscribed with their crimes, so that neighbors would shun them. I found descriptions of these punishments in chronicles from medieval Flanders, where women accused of adultery were paraded in tattered dresses, their heads shaved. The message was clear: step out of line, and you'll be marked for life. Witchcraft accusations were another tool of control, particularly in the later Middle Ages. A woman who was too knowledgeable, too independent, or simply too noticeable could be branded a witch. Healing with herbs, reading, or even refusing to marry could trigger suspicion. I've read trial records from 15th century France, where women were tortured into confessing to deals with the devil, their only crime being a knack for curing fevers or delivering babies. The punishment was often death, burning at the stake, or hanging, though the process of proving guilt was itself a torment. Water tests, where women were thrown into rivers, were a perverse catch. 22. Survival meant guilt, drowning meant innocence, but either way, the woman suffered. Yet, some women turned the system's tools against it. Duels, though rare, were a dramatic form of resistance. The 1552 duel in Naples between Isabella de Corazzi and Diambra de Pettinella is a striking example. Their fight, over a man no less, was a public spectacle, complete with armor, lances, and a crowd. Isabella's choice of weapons, sword, mace, lance, shows a woman seizing a male ritual to assert her agency. Though she conceded defeat, her willingness to fight challenged the notion that women were passive. Similarly, Agnes Hadet's 1395 duel, where she unhorsed her opponent in her father's stead, was a bold reclaiming of honor. These stories, preserved in chronicles and fencing manuals, suggest that women could, and did, wield weapons when pushed to the edge. Marital duels, practiced in parts of Germany and France, were another bizarre form of justice. A husband and wife, locked in dispute, might face off in a pit, he with a club, she with a bag of stones. The winner was deemed right. But the stakes were high. Losing could mean execution or burial alive. These duels, described in Hans Talhofer's 15th century fencing manual, were less about fairness than spectacle. Yet they gave women a rare chance to fight back, even if the odds were stacked against them. I've found illustrations of these contests, the woman's face set with determination, her stones a meager defense against a club. The image lingers, a reminder that even in defeat, these women refused to be invisible. A woman's body was both a battleground and a prison. Nowhere more so than in the expectations placed on her appearance and biology. Fashion was a tool of control, but it was also a physical burden. Corsets, with their whalebone and laces, reshaped the body to fit an ideal of beauty that prioritized appearance over health. I've seen medical treatises from the period warning of suffocation from tight lacing, yet the practice persisted, driven by social pressure. Polanes, those pointed shoes, were another torture. Designed to signal status, they crippled defeat, making even short walks agonizing. I've found accounts of noble women who needed servants to carry them, their shoes more decorative than functional. For peasant women, clothing was simpler but no less restrictive. Heavy woolen dresses, layered for modesty, trapped heat and sweat, especially in summer. Head coverings were a universal mandate. A woman's hair, seen as a source of temptation, had to be hidden under caps, hoods, or veils, often multiple layers at once. Removing them in public was a scandal. In some regions, it was a crime. I've read court records from 14th century Spain, where a woman was fined for letting her braids show during a festival. The punishment wasn't just financial. She was ostracized, her reputation tarnished. Beauty standards added another layer of suffering. A high, smooth forehead was the ideal, leading women to pluck or shave their hairlines, sometimes using caustic paste that burned the skin. Cosmetics, made from white lead or mercury, promised pale skin but delivered sores and poisoning. I've found recipes in medieval herbals for face whiteners that list ingredients like arsenic, a grim reminder of the risks women took to meet society's demands. Menstruation, a natural part of life, was shrouded in shame. The lack of hygiene products meant women relied on rags, often reused and rarely clean, leading to infections. In rural areas where water was scarce, washing was a luxury. I've read accounts of women using herbs like mint to mask odors, a small act of ingenuity in a world that offered little support. Menopause, arriving early due to malnutrition and labor, was another stigma. A woman past her childbearing years was often seen as useless, her value tied to fertility. Yet, for some, it brought a fleeting sense of freedom, a pause in the cycle of pregnancy and risk. Childbirth was the ultimate trial. The absence of medical knowledge made every delivery a gamble. Midwives, though skilled, worked with limited tools and no understanding of infection. In noble households, the presence of witnesses, sometimes dozens, added pressure, turning a private moment into a public event. I've studied chronicles of royal births, like that of Margaret of Anjou in 1430, where the birthing chamber was described as a stage for proving lineage. The tools used, hooks, knives, were as likely to kill as to save. Postpartum care was equally crude. To stop bleeding, women used makeshift compresses, often contaminated, leading to sepsis. The Church's ban on pain relief, seen as interfering with divine punishment, meant women endured labor and agony, their screams a testament to their sinful nature. The psychological toll was immense. Women were taught to see their bodies as vessels for others, husbands, children, God. Any attempt to claim autonomy, whether through contraception or refusal of sex, was a sin. Yet, women persisted. Midwives, often accused of witchcraft, were a lifeline, sharing knowledge that could ease pain or prevent pregnancy. I found references in trial records to women who used charms, amulets of herbs or bones, to assert some control over their bodies. These acts, though small, were radical in a world that sought to strip women of agency. We've walked through a world of control, shame, and survival, but let's end with the women who fought back. Not just with whispers or secret herbs, but with swords, stones, and sheer will. The Middle Ages weren't just a time of oppression. They were a time of defiance of women who, when pushed to the brink, refused to break. The duels we've mentioned, Isabella and Diambra, Agnes Hattet, weren't anomalies. They were the tip of a hidden iceberg, moments when women stepped into the arena of men and demanded to be seen. Consider the marital duels, those strange rituals where a husband and wife faced off in a pit. The rules were absurd, him with a club, her with stones, yet they offered a rare chance for a woman to fight for her truth. I've read accounts in German chronicles where women won these contests, dragging their husbands from the pit to the cheers of onlookers. The victory wasn't just physical. It was a public declaration of agency, a moment when a woman's strength was undeniable. Even in defeat, the act of fighting was a rebellion against silence. Women also resisted through knowledge. Midwives, healers, and nuns, often branded as witches, were the keepers of women's wisdom. They passed down recipes for pain relief, contraception, and healing, risking their lives to help others. I found manuscripts from 13th century convents, written in the margins by nuns, that detail herbal remedies for women's troubles. These texts, hidden from male eyes, were a form of resistance, a way to reclaim the body from a system that sought to control it. In villages, women's networks were a quiet revolution. They shared food, childcare, and warnings, creating a web of solidarity that men couldn't touch. I've read oral histories, recorded centuries later, that speak of women gathering at wells to trade stories of abusive husbands or cruel lords. These gatherings weren't just gossip, they were strategy sessions, a way to survive in a world stacked against them. In markets, women bartered not just goods but information, passing along news of safe paths or sympathetic priests. Even in death, women left their mark. Funerary inscriptions, though rare, sometimes bore their names, a final assertion of identity. I've seen tombstones in rural France, etched with simple words like Matilda, mother, a quiet refusal to be forgotten. Wills, though dictated by men, occasionally included bequests from women to their daughters, a small act of defiance against a system that favored sons. These traces, scattered through archives, are a testament to women who refused to be erased. The Middle Ages were a crucible, forging women who were stronger than the world that sought to break them. They endured because they had no choice, but they also fought, quietly, fiercely, sometimes with weapons, always with will. As a historian, I'm drawn to these stories, not because they're tragic, but because they're human. They remind us that history isn't just kings and battles. It's the women who wove the cloth, bore the children, and, when necessary, picked up the sword. Their lives, though hidden in the shadows, are the heartbeat of the past, and their resilience echoes through the centuries, urging us to listen, to remember, and to honor the fight they never stopped fighting. If this journey through the hidden lives of medieval women has moved you, leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep uncovering the stories that history tried to bury.